Kriti Kamala Shane Bhajatara Charana Deko Shantamone Premonayani Aparupa Priya Darshana Aparupa Priya Darshana.
Babaji, thanks for being here and talking with us. And so we're sitting here under a wonderful picture of Swami Vivekananda and Holy Mother and Sri Ramakrishna and the direct disciples. First question, obvious, is here you are a Westerner in your own ashram in Portland. How did you get here? What brought you to Vedanta, and what was the journey and the...
Yes, Portland is rather key to the whole life journey, as they say. I mean, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, Alaska in part, and then Washington State, and kind of settled here in Portland when I was about 12 years old, and attended grade school here and high school, right across the river from this ashram. It was Markham Annex, I think it was called, through 8th grade, and then Woodrow Wilson High School for 2 years, and Andrew Jackson for the final 2. And I have students now who are actually going to those schools, so Portland's been very key in that regard. So my father and mother settled here because there was a good music program, and they saw musical talent in all their children, like all my siblings. I was 3 brothers and 1 sister. 2 of them have passed, were violinists and had musical talent. So, I got stuck with the cello. You see, I had the big one and the hard, clumsy one, but you could have almost formed a string quartet out of our family at one point, and we were all getting a high quality education and everything. So how that pertains to Vedanta is that, unbeknownst to me, I grew up right across the river from Swami Asheshanandaji Maharaj, who was the last living monastic disciple of Holy Mother, that's Sri Sharada Devi, Holy Mother, we know her affectionately as, and Sri Ramakrishna's divine consort and wife. In the 1800s and 1900s, these 2 great souls lived, and millions of followers now flock to them as great ideals of spirituality. So here I was in Portland, a Westerner, as you say, and I remember, in fact, I was telling a student early today, walking up to my parents when I graduated that high school and in college, and going to college and having to pick a language, and there was about 8 languages, and they said, "Which one have you picked?" And I said Sanskrit, because there was a Sanskrit teacher here at the time, and they said, "Oh, no, you don't want that, that's a dead language." Of course,
had you already known about Sanskrit and Indian philosophy? Is that why
at that point
you
I
chose
hadn't.
that?
No, I was 18.
So what do you think drew you to say I wanted to learn Sanskrit?
Well, of course, that gets into deeper teachings of what we call samskaras, not samsara. Make sure that's rounds of birth and death and ignorance. But samskara means a mental impression that's been planted in your mind by repetitive actions and thoughts from previous lifetimes. Mm-hmm. So it's it automatically puts you on a different footing than Western thinking, because we don't think in those terms. Even our psychology doesn't think in those terms. But yoga psychology does. It feels like, and teaches along the way that you form these lifetimes out of these samskaras and their residue from past actions. And that's karma and reincarnation all begins to play into that, you see. So it's a very profound thing to learn, and it was for me when I was young. I mean, I actually left for a symphonic career when I was 20, left Portland, went to Hawaii and joined the symphony there. It was a very good symphony at that time. And came back, and while I was there in Hawaii, I met our founder, Lex Hickson, who was the SRV Association's founder. And he told me about Swami Asheshanandaji Maharaj back in Portland, so I'd actually have to, go through my schooling, grow up, go away for a year, find out about Swami Asheshananda, then come back to Portland.
He'd been there all the time.
Yeah, I'd been there all the time. And so that, of course, pushed me definitely along the Vedantic way of Swami Vivekananda, who came here in 1893 with these teachings.
So, had you had any teacher before Swami Asheshananda? Was he your
spiritual teacher? The very first spiritual book I read was the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, and this is known as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So Then I had some affiliations with Tibetan Buddhism, always keeping Ramakrishna sort of at the forefront of my mind, even before I was actually initiated, mantra diksha they call it, into the path. I was having communications with, and darshan we say, I was looking for a word there, but communion with Karmapa and Dalai Lama and people like that. I was coming in contact with, along with the founder Lex Dixon of SRV. He was actually 10 years my senior, so kind of a mentor, and he was pulling me into these situations that we know Sri Ramakrishna is an exemplar of universal harmony, universal religion. So in that way, it was preparing me even back then in my 20s and 30s. But yes, to answer simply, really Ramakrishna was there from the very beginning for me, and then I found out about other teachers and other religions under his auspice, you might say. And then I finally did take initiation not too long after that with Swami Sheshananda here in Portland.
So what was it like just to meet him for the first time, Swami Sheshananda? What was your impression, and what kind of impact did that have on you internally?
Well, this brings in also Jaima Music, which was a musical group I had formed. And it consisted of myself as singer and instrumentalist, and my wife as recitation, and sometimes an Indian dancer and an Indian tabla players. So we were on the scene long before a lot of the popular people of the time who were doing tours and kirtans and things like that, singing what's called bhajan and stotram. So devotional songs of India and teaching, songs with teachings in them. So we were moving about doing that, and I bring that up mainly here is because I met so many of the top 10 gurus, you might say, of the time through the 70s and 80s doing that, and also knew of Swami Sheshananda early on in that time period. So I was already contrasting these popular teachers with this very little known monk in Portland here who had just a small following of 25, 50 people, but who's actually spiritually famous amongst the Ramakrishna devotees around the world, because he was the last living monastic devotee of Holy Mother. So in that way then I saw the difference between him and other teachers, and even though I had access to these other teachers who had these very large followings, I came back and chose this monk who was so deep in wisdom. That was the difference I saw between him and other teachers, is that he was a realized soul in the what we call the Jnana Yoga path, the path of wisdom.
So that was a fascinating time that you were touring. It was the early 70s, and there was the migration of a lot of Indians coming, teachers coming to the States, and started getting popular in the West. So you were kind of touring around seeing that birth. So what were the qualities that you saw that were good or bad or missing in most of what was going on in that early Renaissance of...
probably much the same qualities as far as missing qualities that Swami Vivekananda saw in 1893, was it? Let me get my dates right. 1893 at the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, only, accented and maybe exacerbated, you might say, by, the last 100 years or so of expansion in the West, where people had to sample yoga and sample Vedanta and Buddhism, and, teachers. There were some great teachers that came along in Buddhism, and a few in Vedanta followed Swami Vivekananda too. But there was a whole cross-section of spiritual, or maybe even call them pseudo-spiritual opportunists that were making money, and so that was unfortunate in a way. It taught the Westerners, hopefully, to be less gullible and more discriminating in their choice of teachers. And you have to allow for this, because there's kindergarten and there's grade school and there's high school in the secular level too. But it also happens in the spiritual realm, that people have a sort of period where they can grow and graduate. So that has to be allowed. But probably also needs to be said that there are some souls and like for instance our founder Lex Hixon and other great souls who came straight to these masterful teachers in Buddhism and in Vedanta particularly. Because unfortunately, and it's probably why Vivekananda didn't accent it so much, yoga had a harsh turn with hatha, you see. And so people were actually replacing the word hatha, yoga with hatha. And so the other 7 limbs didn't really get their fair shake. You know, Patanjali, the father of yoga, had this system where he wanted to, he's probably one of the most competent holistic teachers of our time, because he lived fairly recently, really. You know, if you look at it in the scope of India's history, which goes way back thousands of years prior to Jesus. So you wanted to create work on all levels of your being, not just physically, but with the prana, and not just with the prana, but with the psyche, and not just with the psyche, but the intellect, and finally to the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And you saw Swami Sheshananda as an exemplar of that.
oh, my goodness, yes. I mean, he was a living, liberated soul, and I'd never seen one. And there he was, right in my own city, and this is greatly due to the work of Vivekananda, jumping the ocean like Hanuman did once, and bringing the Vedanta here to that Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. That's probably the most significant spiritual event in Western history. And I feel that because Vivekananda did that, we finally have a patron saint, if you want to use that term, in Vivekananda, because we'd have to look to Europe to find beings like that. And they weren't all that many of them, you see. But to have a great soul like that champion America, you know, come here and give himself on the highest and deepest level of Vedanta and yoga, and because Vivekananda used to say that there really, when you look at it, there's no difference between Vedanta and Buddhism. He was very much in recognition of the fact that these were both systems out of India, and that Buddhism was probably, you know, more current and was having its heyday. But Vedanta was the underground river that was always there, sort of like the thread that goes through the pearls, like Sri Krishna speaks of in the Gita.
Yeah, no, I could feel your admiration for Swamiji when you speak about him. And I'm also remembering I was driving you past the Swami Sheshananda's ashram, and you told me you used to stand outside and look up at his window with tears in your eyes of gratitude.
Oh no,
So
we're getting personal.
it makes me wonder, like, what kind of transformation personally did you feel? You know, what was the before and after? What? Yeah, we know what a great person she was, but what was your experience of you think that made you blossom into what you've become, a spiritual teacher?
Well, I had been studying for a good 10 or 11 years before I took initiation from him. So since I was 19, I came to recognition of Indian spirituality. And I always had a great love for Jesus, and I never had a narrowness or a fundamentalism in my mind. I always thought everything is divine, and you'd have to, you know, strip off the coverings in order to see it in some cases. Mm-hmm. So with that sort of temperament in me, and, you know, being attracted to Sanskrit early on, and reading the great epics early on, like Bhagavad Gita and Vivekachudamani by Shankara, and books on yoga, finding the difference between just the hatha movement and these other 7 limbs that were treating other levels of your being, I began to work on myself early on. And so I came to Swami Sheshananda with some good spiritual mileage under my feet, my belt, you know, and then he took me from there and gave me the initiation and brought it out further. I always felt like I really got a boost from that sacred mantra he gave me, which was, of course, bringing in not just the scriptures, but God with form, as Sri Ramakrishna used to talk about. It's very important to have an ishtam, that's a chosen ideal, or God with form as an exemplar. You get to the Father through the Son kind of ideas there in many religions. So very rare that a being will jump straight to non-duality and have samadhi, and, you know, or there are many people who maybe imagine they do. They've just gone all of a sudden empty-headed, but it's fullness that is samadhi. It's the fullness, and not just a glimpse of light that you see, but as Shankar used to say, it's a hailstone falling in an ocean kind of feeling. You feel totally full, and you get the not just the glimpse, as I was saying, but the full experience, at least for the time that you're allotted that by the grace of the Divine Mother, we say. See?
Yeah. Well,
they ask, what is enlightenment, right? There's even a magazine out by that.
Yes.
But Shankara answered that a long time ago, very nicely in 700. He said, Om Vedanta Siddhanta Nirukti Resha Brahmaiva Jivaham Sakalam Jagat Cha Akanda Rupastiti Areva Moksho Brahmadvitiye Shrutayaha Pramanam. So it means it's the last and final conclusion of the Vedanta that all is Brahman. Time, space, living beings, and the world. Living in constant recognition of this fact is what is called enlightenment. So he states it straight out like that.
Yeah.
This is back in 700 AD that he put out, that's in the Vivekachudamri, the crest jewel of discrimination. So if you're asking what is enlightenment, you say it's time, space, living beings, and the world, as long as you keep it in mind that it's that. But as soon as you forget yourself in time, in space, amongst living beings and relationships, and in the world, which is Maya, you're running a risk of not keeping that enlightenment, which is your divine inheritance.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when I read his, I didn't have the good fortune to attend his lectures, but in reading his lectures, he has such a powerful grasp of that knowledge of Brahman. I can only imagine what it was like to be around him and actually see somebody living and breathing.
Yeah, I think you went.
I met him once. I touched the dust of took the dust of his feet, but he was, all his senses were pretty much gone. This was about a year before he died.
Yeah, in his 90s he lived, and he could still recite the Gita by memory in totality into his 90s. He used to make that distinction between celibacy or sannyas and full memory that lasts.
Yes.
Lasts. So these great souls, I've been calling it lately in my recent series of classes, savoring, mental savoring. You just memorize these slokas and you read these scriptures and you have a mantra and you can imagine or envision your ishtam, and you just spend your time inward.
Contentedly and be free.
Yes, pass your time contentedly and be free, exactly.
Which brings up an interesting question I've had. I've been thinking, about part of your journey. When I first met you, you had a recording studio, and I remember I stayed with you on Oahu, and you were working, 8 hours, and you came back, and so there was all of us, I think, have a journey trying to make spirituality more central to our lives. It's sort of like, I think you put it once, claiming inner terrain. Okay, so there was some process where you went from being a musician and you dove in full time. I mean, you left, you closed the recording studio. Was that like a difficult, what was that like for you to really make that jump? Because I think all of us have a little, it takes a lot of courage to really make space for spirituality. To cancel something you have to do a retreat or to, and you went whole hog, I mean, so to speak. And I saw when you were working full time, and then a few years later you dropped it. I mean, what was that?
Now that you bring it up, I feel so natural in it now, because since my late 30s, I've come out of the closet in that way and just proclaimed that spirituality first and music was later. And before I was acting as if music was first, because it was kind of leading me. So in India, music is a path. Shabda Brahman, it's a path to God through sound. But there are certain mainstays and requisites you're going to have to follow to make the music divine. And of course, working in the world and selling yourself to different venues, like anyone, you're going to have to expose yourself to money and Maya and so forth. And you're going to have to walk that line and keep vigil, keep your discrimination up. So it's a difficult path for everyone. But I feel so natural in it now that I can, when you first asked this question, I was thinking, oh, that was easy, but now you're causing me to think of some of the difficulties that I had making that transition. And a lot of it, some of it has to do with family and upbringing. You have to remake yourself to them. Not that you're going out trying to do that in any overt way, but you have had an inner transformation that no one's seen. Holy Mother used to say that. Why have you come to see me? Have I grown two horns? Is one of her statements. In other words, if you've gone to see this great divine goddess on earth, Sri Sharda Devi, because she all of a sudden transformed outwardly? No, she was pure and perfect from the get-go, and it began manifesting out, and then people felt the light and they came to her. Like Shankar used to say, when the lotus blooms in the woods, the bees will come. They don't need an invitation. Right? So there's a time for all of that to happen. But the transition time that you're walking is precarious sometimes. And so I remember having to deal with changing my vocation, if you will. I've never thought of spirituality as a vocation, but to put it in description that is understandable. It was symphony life first for 12 years as a professional, and of course my young life was filled with Portland Junior Symphony here. Was a great orchestra with Jacob Avshalomov as the conductor for decades. It was one of the most famous youth symphonies. That's why my father and mother settled here. So I went touring to Europe with them, and I won scholarships back to Boston and places in that organization. So my whole youth was that way. Then entered the symphony life professionally and found out how jaded it can be. That it's for money and career and fame. And that doesn't go well with spirituality. That you were holding in a beautiful but sort of naive way up to the point when you had to become a professional. So, yeah, that was a transition that was rather odd, as the world is rather an odd place. And then finally having to, the spiritual part of it I would say was very natural to me. I was studying scriptures and doing yoga in a secluded place when I was 20. And that just seemed to be, as soon as I got away from upbringing and family and schooling, I just fell right into that naturally. It wasn't something that I had to seek. I just, as Krishna says in the Gita, picked up the thread of the yoga from the past lifetime, but there were these 19 years of paying debt to society and family and growing up and school and all that in the West in a materialistic society. So there was a difficulty there, but as more pertinent to your question, in my 20s and then into my 30s, I think early mid-30s, I did shut down that recording studio. I quit the symphony after a while and went into recording and put out a lot of my own music as a result of that. Some good instrumental meditation music. The New Age was going on in the 80s, so I was putting out New Age music that was flavored with classical that I was schooled in, classical Western, and classical raga too, that I was also getting interested in. So that began to flavor my whole 30s, and then eventually going on tour with that Jaima music ensemble was very key, because then I began teaching from the musical platform. And it's good that you bring this up, because then it causes me to remember how I got here, in the sense, is that I was giving teachings that I had been learning back in my 20s, and with my mouth shut, never talking to anyone for a long time. Then music gave me a platform in which to introduce these teachings to the Western audiences who were interested in yoga and Vedanta and Buddhism and Samkhya and other systems that talk about things that are missing in your Western society, right? So that was very key, the Jaima Music Ensemble, for those years that we were touring around doing it. And in that period, Lex Dixon and a bunch of us formed SRV associations national back in New York. And then it was so far away, and we were back here on the West Coast and in Hawaii, so finally I managed to form with some of my followers and friends some 3 ashrams here in the West Coast, San Francisco, Portland, and Hawaii, and one back in New England for a while. And so that then led to teaching more, and the music sort of got behind it. I never ever gave it up. I still refer to it because it's such a beautiful vehicle for the teachings.
Mm.
Spoonful of medicine, as they say.
Yeah. Also, in terms of really,
I'm sorry, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine.
in terms of the, I imagine making that leap from full-time spirituality, not the, as a formal teacher.
Yeah.
That's a huge internal shift. I've also been extremely admiring of your productivity as like an artist, as a writer and a musician, the volume of CDs and music that you put out, the books that come out like clockwork. It's staggering, that kind of productivity, and it speaks of like a real intense inner concentration and like there's some kind of bulwark against distraction that you obviously have. Which I thought of when you're talking about Swami Sheshananda, just taking that strong inner position. So that had I would think that relates to you being able to kind of put all the worldly stuff behind you.
Yes, and I see where you're going with that too, because music was, the 6th, 7th, and 8th limbs of yoga, as we were just mentioning. You have to get beyond your physical asanas and get into mental asanas, is the way I've been putting it. If you take certain mental asanas, then that will destroy karmas and samskaras and things, blockages that Hatha Yoga will never remove. Hundreds and thousands of asanas, Shankara, to quote him, will never remove your mental samskaras and blockages. So that gets into that realm of the mind. And if you can master the mind after you've mastered the prana, after you've mastered the senses, after you've mastered the body, that's the succession of yoga takes you. So how music helped me to do that was concentration. You just sort of start at the 6th limb. I mean, yes, you have to sit. I play the cello, or play the flute, or you play the violin, like my brother is an excellent violinist. So you have a position you master. So they're automatically sort of like sitting cross-legged. That opens up the base of the spine, and we call it Udgata, what's precursor to Kundalini Yoga, is already flowing up as soon as you spread your legs like that and sit like a yogi. Well, as soon as you assume this position, or flute position, or cello, or double bass position, it's a mudra. It's a mental asana that the body is following. So you can look back and see, I've played violin many lifetimes, I've played cello many lifetimes, and that's why it's so easy for me. Or other people, it's not so easy for them. So they haven't mastered it in a previous lifetime. It's a very interesting teaching. And it's the same with lawyering or business or doctoring and so forth. There are people who just take to it right away, and that's not always a good thing, to be stuck in a vocation lifetime after lifetime. But where yoga comes in then, concentration is very key to that. And if you can concentrate on anything, whatever it is, you'll be a success in life. And doesn't mean you're rich or famous. That can actually be a real obstacle to success. What you want is enlightenment, self-realization is being called, or to have nirvana, or moksha, or mukti, or kaivalya, or samadhi. Those kinds of things are the blessings, the real blessings of life. And building character along the way, as Holy Mother said, is the requisite for that. So, concentration, it will, actually what you said is very beautiful, bulwark against distraction. And what's the opposite? Brooding. Lord Shiva has that teaching, that the curtain of nescience in you, the curtain of ignorance in you, is built from doubt, and from fear, and from ignorance. Those are the three contents of the curtain of ignorance in you. And he said, the curtain of nescience thickens if you brood on doubt, fear, and ignorance. So if you don't brood on it, it tends to thin, and you can begin to see through it. So the difference between a seer and an ordinary person, or a deluded person, or a person who's suffering, is that curtain of nescience is being thickened by brooding, or they're not brooding anymore. They're not worrying, they're not stressed out, they're peaceful, and that curtain over time gets so thin that pretty soon you can just see the light of Brahman behind it.
It brings up an interesting question for me, because I look back on some of your books from 20 years ago, your articles, and it seems like the wisdom is there just as much as it is now. So it makes me think, like, I mean, did you always have that freedom from nescience, or do you feel it deepening and widening as you age or mellow as a teacher?
Yeah, that's a good teaching. I mean, the way I would describe it now is the way Lord Buddha described it when his disciple asked him, or told him, you say that there are two kinds of beings, the free and the bound, but isn't there a third kind of being who's trying to get free? And Lord Buddha, in effect, said, no, the beings who are trying to get free are already free. So he stayed with his stance that there are just two kinds of beings, the enlightened or the free souls and the bound souls. So that means the minute you start seeking, you have this inner urge, and it does take some yearning, some determination, some thinning of the veils. I mean, the curtain of nescience is a nice teaching, but what's in brooding and fear and ignorance are a lot of samskaras and karmas and problems that you're dealing with in upbringing and society, and all of that is a part of it. So you're going to have to work through that. But anyway, to consider yourself free then would be kind of the jump to the chase teaching there. You don't consider yourself to be bound anymore. And so there's a time when you could say, I got enlightened. In that way, it's a flash. But the mind doesn't always realize it. That's a teaching from Holy Mother. The mind has to catch up to the fact that it got enlightened, and the mind is slower than consciousness, and slower than the mind, and its thoughts are light, and slower than that is sound. So there's a spectrum of going on there in terms of spiritual evolution.
It reminds me a little bit about the teaching in the Gita where Arjuna asked Krishna, asked to describe a soul who's boundless or free, and like how walk, how talk, how does he act? Which brings me to the book that you wrote, the Avadhut, which is, to me, it's remarkable. It's like a meditation or a contemplation of what would a person be like who is unbound. How does he live? And this is your answer. So it's beautiful in that you can see the depth of contemplation that you've done, and what does it take to be a boundless soul. And I was very struck also by we were in San Francisco when you read it to us. You read a chapter to us before it was published, and there was a section you were like hysterically laughing. It was like somebody else had written it, and it made me realize that there's a way that you've actually embedded these teachings in you and in yourself and embodied them, but it's also you don't take credit for it in a way. I've got a few questions around this book. It's almost like the old Kung Fu TV series. I think of him as, I wish there was a TV series about the Avadhut, walking the land and meeting people. It would be great. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to
write that book?
Yeah.
I saw a need for it. As a genre, there's really no place to put it. There are some books that are like it, where people created stories of holy men that walked around. And basically, I can't call it fiction, although I did create the situations that the Avadhut moves through. But in the Uddhava Gita, actually, there's a teaching of the 24 teachers of the Avadhut, and it's just a bare mention. There's the bee, there's the spider, there's the prostitute, the courtesan, and there's the arrow maker, and so this man just, it's inferred in that very short 24 slokas, basically, or maybe 25 or 26 slokas, of that this was the teachers that this man had. So I just looked at that and I said, let's flesh that out, let's fatten that, turn it into a spiritual novel, if you will. And so I gave him a name, and I gave his teachers names, and and the people he met, and these teachers that were, it's just beautiful because everyone's attracted to nature, but ultimately enlightenment is getting beyond nature. Let's face it. If you haven't realized that, then you're still attached to nature, or you still want to have the adventure of consciousness in nature. You're still enamored with form. not necessarily a bad thing, but be careful, you see, because you can get stuck in it for lifetimes. And you can suffer. First noble truth about the world from Lord Buddha is there is suffering. So all of that is a given, which you can talk about more in classes and so forth. There is a way of living life in nature that is very liberating and very beautiful, very freeing. Of course, attachment and detachment would need to be there. So the avadhuta is a person who just walks around free of family, free of money, free of where his next meal is coming from. He's sort of like a sannyasin, but there is a cross-section of avadhuts in India. There's I hate to use the word cult, it doesn't have the greatest connotations, but there is a sampradaya or a sect of avadhuts. And so I studied about them some, and some of them even go about naked, and so once I had some background for that, and then I had that beautiful piece out of the Uddhava Gita, Sri Krishna's teachings, then I began to formulate the actual chapters, 24 of them, on each teacher. So he would meet the arrow maker, he'd meet he'd see the Brahmarakita and the cockroach, getting together and staying in meditation forever, and then one day they let go. There were various things that he went through that had a quality assigned to them: concentration, meditation, compassion. Like with concentration, like you say, free from the bulwark of distraction. The arrow maker was that for him, because he visited his friend the arrow maker in some Indian village that I made up, and he was sitting there just resting one night. He never stayed anywhere more than a couple nights, as they do. They wander. And he lay down on the floor for a little rest, and then his arrow maker friend went on fletching arrows and shaping them for some big order he got from the king for the king's army, right? So he had to make all these arrows. So Avadhut just observed him over the next few hours, just fully concentrating on making the shafts straight, and attaching the heads and feathers and everything. And even when a marriage procession went by, with all the elephants and camels and clowns or whatever there was there jumping around, his door was open. He never looked up once or went out to join the fun. And it was a perfect concentration the whole time until he got his job done. So that's inferred in the teaching of the arrow maker. He said, "I salute you as my teacher of concentration." Perfect, unbroken concentration. So that's kind of then I just put together the 24 chapters and
but yeah, and I think it takes that kind of concentration to write. I mean, to me, this is a decade's worth of somebody's life, and you kind of, I guess it represents decades of contemplation.
Yes, or lifetimes, you might say, if you believe in that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's probably took me a year and a half. It's not that I spent every minute of every day writing that book, but there are things to do, of course.
Yeah.
But it's one of the books that came out of that period, and it's unique of the books I've put out because it doesn't really have a genre it fits nicely into, but you get to get all these powerful spiritual teachings from the Dharma in there, but put in a story-like form, and that's always been one of the better aspects of Hindu scripture. Call it the Itihasa sometimes, or even the Upanishads have stories where Nachiketas would go and meet the god of death in the Katha Upanishad. That's an interesting setup right there.
Yeah.
You go meet death. His father says, "I give you to death," and so he always obeys his father, so he took him literally and went to find Mr. Death. And then Mrs. Death let him in. And, so the whole, and then when his death came, Yama, he asked him, "What's beyond you?" And he wouldn't take any boons or anything else. He just wanted his father to forgive him first, and then he wanted to know what was beyond death. And one other small boon in there, some sacrifice he had to do. But the whole, then, most of that Upanishad, which is an easy read for anyone who wants to get deep into these scriptures of non-dual truth, is about what death answered, about what lies beyond him. So India's always had this very wonderful penchant and ability to put together the world with spiritual teachings without compromising the latter. I mean, you have to live in the world if you're in form, some world. It's either this outer world or it's the inner worlds, kingdoms of heaven within. And so you need to learn how to do that and to sojourn. You know. My teacher's name, Sheshananda, means, one way of putting it would be the bliss of having no residue. So he lived his whole life without any residue, like a bird flying through the air and leaving no trace. And that's, these kinds of souls are like that. They don't leave any residue behind that will pull them back in ignorance. Now, they may want to come back by choice, but that's different. We often give that teaching, you can have, here's your options, Dharmic life, divine life, no life, because that's the highest in the Hindu tradition, in Vedanta. No life means formlessness. With the highest realization, you're not coming back into bodies anymore. And that's full-on samadhi, nirvikalpa, sampragyata, these higher states of awareness they talk about.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't know what they are, so you can't imagine how blissful, how complete they are. But what you don't want is worldly life, or a life of suffering and evil, and that kind of thing. So those levels of life, start with Dharmic life. And back to one of your early questions, that's what I saw missing when I went around seeing these teachers and finding Swami Sheshanandaji, was that the Dharma was not being given out in the West. It was just being given in some small circles of people would come in Buddhism and Vedanta, but children weren't being raised in it like in India in the old times. And so you begin to think, wow, if I'm born in the West again, I better get Dharmic parents, but how's that possible when you don't see any? When you didn't get it from your parents, you had to go try and be born next to a Swami across a river and come back, 10 years later and have him teach you. And then you say, thank my lucky stars, as it were, that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could be, coming back again and again in ignorance.
Yeah, I mean, there but for the grace of God, having been taking your teachings for 21 years now, I have to say it hasn't been until the last few years that I've realized there's something else has been going on that I didn't even realize, which I suppose is transmission. That I didn't realize what I was getting into. So I actually got more than I bargained for, which is to my great delight.
Well, it's probably why I was standing down below Swami Sheshananda's ashram at the bus stop, looking up at his window and crying, because I thank you for being here in Portland, of all places, in the West, in 1980, giving me these teachings that I've never heard the like of.
Yeah.
And I could have just gone on, maybe been a symphony musician, which isn't a bad life, but I had no idea of the Dharma whatsoever in a lifetime. So, yeah.
Now, speaking of the grace of God as well, I remember being a 14, 15-year-old teenager in my middle-class Brooklyn existence and hearing Lex Hix's radio program, which was like a fog
spirit,
cover.
yeah.
Yeah, and so, which was a remarkable experience to me. I was looking back on it in hindsight, it was just this ray of light coming through. So what was it like for you to meet him, and what were the circumstances?
Lex Hixon.
Meeting Lex Hixon.
Well, as I say, it was catalyst and key to me even finding Swami Sheshananda, because he was the one that told me, you love Ramakrishna, right? And I said, yes, and I've been reading his books and looking into him for the last 2, 3, 4 years on my own. I said, did you know that he left a lineage, and you know about Swami Vivekananda? Of course I did, but he also has the last living devotee of Holy Mother, his wife, is living in Portland, Oregon, and that's where I had just come from and joined the symphony in Hawaii. So then I went to see him right away, because I was coming back to visit my aging mother, and my sisters and brothers were still alive, so I would come back to Portland, Oregon in the summers when the symphony season was off. And at holy days, like on Vivekananda's birthday or Shivaratri, or especially Kali or Durga Puja, come to Swami Sheshananda's ashram, and the place would just be a mart of joy. It wasn't dance around, sing, lose yourself in some sort of kirtan ecstasy joy. It was deep, profound wisdom joy of people who were serious about getting free. And that was, of course, one of those differences I saw in Swami Sheshananda and most the Swamis of the Ramakrishna order. We haven't seen a distribution of jnana wisdom like this since back in the time of Gaudapada and Shankara probably. So this is on the scene about 1,300 years later after that, and being put into all the languages of the world too. It's getting, these great teachings of India are getting put into different languages, and people are writing books about them in their language, in their own way. So anyway, back to what you're saying, going back to see Swami Sheshananda was an interesting experience. It's like an eternal companion had just come back into your life, and you recognized him right away, and everything he said was truth, and he was also frightening, to people who came to him, because he was a no-nonsense kind of teacher. But I got talking about him. But anyway, Lex Sixon led me to him, told me you should go back there and see that man. And so I did, got interested, and asked him for initiation soon. He made me wait about a year, and then he initiated myself and my wife both on Holy Mother's birthday to the Vedanta path, and gave the mantra to Ram Krishna and Holy Mother to us. And then Lex and I began to meet, him from New York, me from Hawaii. We'd meet in Portland on Vivekananda's birthday or on Durga Puja every year, several times a year, and spend time with Swami Sheshananda. So it was a beautiful time, and again, finding your eternal companions in life. You'd never met people like this in your life. You loved your family and your friends, but they were nothing compared, nothing in spiritual stature compared to these beings. Yeah. And you got an idea what it was like to be free. Whereas you couldn't say that about family and society and schooling and politics and all that. You weren't seeing people getting enlightened in those modes. It just wasn't happening. It doesn't happen. You'll get a few lights, geniuses, scientists, Gandhis, and, but they're mixing up the spirituality with the world necessarily, as it were. But these beings who had just renounced the world outright and were living in this path of enlightenment, they weren't participating in the way of becoming anymore. They were living in being and becoming. They had arrived. And so that's what you found with the Swami Sheshananda ji and other Swamis I met. And Swami Nityaswarupananda was also living at the time until he passed. He was the only other living disciple of Holy Mother. And then Lex Hickson, a Westerner who was evincing and epitomizing this freedom too, in his own flexible, childlike, beautiful way. He's a unique being. So, I can't say that I'm certain about the enlightenment of many Westerners. They're on their way or they're working. Like I say, once you hear about it, hear the truth, and the truth will set you free, there's got to be a lifetime or two, like the Buddhists say, maybe even 3 lifetimes. 1 lifetime to recognize the truth, 2 to practice a sadhana that will break down those barriers, and 3 to live an enlightened life. 3 lifetimes is a general kind of scenario. But when I met people like Lex Hickson, and of course some of these grace-filled teachers, swamis, and I had no doubt that those were free souls. That's it. So if they've arrived, then I've arrived. And now teach me. Now teach me what it is to live on this non-dual level and never leave it again. Write books from it if I have to. And so there's the death of distraction. And as my teachers say, the death of death. You put death in its own grave. Is one of his sayings.
Lex wrote this beautiful book, Great Swan, which is it's a little bit like your the Yavadhut in a way. It's meditating on a great being and becoming that great being and
Mental
writing
savoring.
about that. Yeah. Now if I could go back in time, I would have loved to have been on that tour when you toured. Jaima Music toured with Lex.
Oh yes.
What was that like?
Great Swan
that
tour,
must
we
have
called
been,
it.
must have been wonderful to be traveling with him and keep doing the readings and music together.
Going around to bookstores, I've done that before. It's very difficult work, and it doesn't bring a lot of exposure. You have to have people interested in spirituality first, and there's not that many of them. But so he wanted a venue, and he was always encouraging me to do Jaima Music and go out. Sometimes he would even fund certain things we did, like album covers of CDs, and he was there readily with some of the green power, the Lakshmi energy to help us. So we finally put together this great Swan tour, where I think we gave 24 appearances in 30 days, of all things, and went all around to different cities and flew and drove, and I mean, we were playing in colleges sometimes, and a lot of Hindu temples, Muslim tekkas, because he was beginning to get into the Sufi tradition, and the Sufis liked us, and Buddhist Dharma centers, and like Naropa, and some of the big places that were known, and also some of the places that were kind of popular, through the spiritual hangouts, that people were doing a lot of hatha yoga and that, but they didn't really know about the scriptures and the depth of the Jnana Yoga path. So Dharma music was there to how you say, teachers come and want to impart you a lesson, And spirituality just isn't all bliss and dancing and singing, but here, let's learn some meditation, some contemplation, some concentration, and some wisdom. And so I really saw that as Dharma, if it's a good coverall term for it, is missing in the West. And having a hard time getting a start in lieu of, or in the face of, a preoccupation with surface bhakti, surface devotion, and physical yoga. Having a hard time getting a foothold because of that for many decades, several decades, if not still.
Now, we've talked about Jai Ma music, and of course this is a Divine Mother path that we're on. And two of your earliest books were the 24 Aspects of Mother Kali and the 10 Divine Articles of Sri Durga. So what were you trying to communicate to us in the West about the goddess, and what do we need to understand about her, and what drew that, what birthed this in you, and what were you aiming to do with this?
I think it's sort of, although it probably wasn't absolutely intentionally that it was doing it, it was my study of Sri Ramakrishna, which means my meditation on Sri Ramakrishna for years, began to show me the unique facets of that great soul. Whether you, as Vivekananda said, whether you call him an avatar or an illumined soul or a great being or a sage or a seer, just come to know him. To know about him, that's enough. But, so we don't want to necessarily go on and on about his avatarhood, although, we believe in that. 5 million people believe in that. But back to studying him, found out that several facets were uniquely his. Universality of all religions, although he wasn't probably purposefully doing that. He just loved religion and all, and he was going to find God through every one. So, he took a Muslim teacher and had a vision of Muhammad and had a vision of Jesus through the Christian path and so forth. And of course his own Indian paths. He had darshan. In fact, there's a beautiful chalisa on him that we're going to sing tomorrow night downstairs in our temple here in Portland, which has a line that runs, "Gods and goddesses revealed themselves to him in multitudes." That's one of the lines of the Chalisa that you sing. So that was what he was having in these kingdoms of heaven within. He was having darshan with all these guardians and overseers of these inner kingdoms and his inner meditations, and having darshan of some very powerful deities too. So anyway, universality of all religions was one thing. And closer to home here with these books was that the releasing of Shakti power, the bringing of consciousness of the Divine Mother of the universe into our awareness, especially in the West, but even back to India, which had begun to kind of, because if you're worshiping the Divine Mother, then your country, is flourishing, but India wasn't in this day and age. And Vivekananda used to weep about that too, and say we need to propitiate Divine Mother Shakti and bring her out if you want rejuvenation of the country to happen, which has been happening now. India is beginning to take some of its old status back. But anyway, these two books, 24 Aspects of Mother Kali and 10 Articles of Divine of Sri Durga, were my way of showing that Divine Mother was not just a form with 10 arms or 4 arms, but those forms had significance. Each arm has a weapon or a significance, and you need to meditate on those. Sort of like Samkhya Yoga wants you to meditate on earth, water, fire, air, and ether, and attach them to smelling, tasting, seeing, hearing, and touching, right? Or seeing, touching, and hearing, if you want to go in order. So that's yoga's way of alambanic meditation. You actually come to know their connections, and if you know them, you get rid of your fear of them, and you connect to the inner realms. It's quintuplication process, 5 by 5, which is another book that's coming out. But using that as a sort of example, then these articles and these arms and these hands on these great goddesses really represent powerful things symbolically. And then you come to know more of who they are when you meditate on their personage like that. And I felt, back then, in fact, I didn't really see any books on Mother Kali that were, and Lex put out his book, Lex Shiksen put out his book, the Tantric Hymns of Enlightenment, of Ram Prasad's songs about Mother Kali, and beautiful, like English mantras, pages of English mantras, perfectly proportioned and expressed. So that had been an example to me, and Sri Ramakrishna had been an example to me of Divine Mother path and how it needs to be brought out and walked. People can walk it. Divine Mother wisdom, and so those books exemplify that as best as I could. Those were my first 2 books, really.
Well, I think we've just barely scratched the surface. Of course, she's very difficult to know and a vast subject, but I think we're running out of time now, so we'll bring this conversation to Pralaya and to be arise again. But thank you so much for sharing all this personal stuff and wisdom as well, and it's been very wonderful and illuminating. So thank you.
Thank you. You're a great interviewer, divine interviewer. Thank you so much.